Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another one of our Tring Book Festival events. Can I welcome to the stage our host for the night, Mike Naylor.
Hello there. My inner Mick Jagger got refuted, but just by my guest just now. I was going to dance on, but they said don't. Anyway, welcome to the High Street Baptist Church. Nice to see you in the audience, and welcome to you if you're listening or watching online. It's day 7 of the Tring Book Festival. And we're going to spend the night together talking about one of the most famous bands in the world. The Rolling Stones have sold 240 million records. They made 30 studio albums, 33 live ones, released 39 or 29 compilation albums, and they were the first band to score a #1 album in 6 different decades. They created the soundtrack to millions of people's lives, I guess yours included. But it's more than just rock and roll, because the fallout they created from their hedonistic lifestyle has been immense and often tragic. Well, our first guest tonight has been writing, well, for a long time about music, and he started when he was still at school, writing for the Record Mirror. He's contributed to The Times and Sunday Times and many American titles, and made many documentaries for BBC Radio 2, including 3 about the Rolling Stones. His book, Charlie's Good Tonight, is the authorised biography of the Stones drummer Charlie Watts, who sadly died last year at the age of 80. So, ladies and gentlemen, please would you welcome Paul Sexton. And our second guest, I'm delighted to say, spent a quarter of a century working in Fleet Street. You probably remember that name. It's not the home of papers now, but she was a reporter, a feature writer and columnist for many, many national papers. She's a regular on TV and radio, a voiceover artist, and she's written books on John Lennon, David Bowie, Freddie Mercury, and Mark Bolan. Here to talk about her latest, The Stone Age, 60 years of the Stones. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lesley-Ann Jones. Thank you. Well, I must say I enjoyed reading all of your books, both your books. And with 60 years of material to go at, I guess it was always going to be a thorough and detailed book or books. But Lesley-Ann, if I come to you first, lots of Stones books have been published in that time, and I think you referenced 40 in the bibliography. Did you have a plan in your head at the start to know the shape of the book and what was going to be in it?
No, it always starts with a blank page. It comes with the research, it comes with the interviews, and it takes shape over time. What I did know was that my approach is always this when I do a book about a rock star, an artist, or a band, is that I'm taking specifically a female viewpoint. Most rock writers are male. Most rock writers had posters of these artists on their bedroom walls and wanted to grow up to be them. I didn't know very many girls who were in that boat. I came at it from a different angle. So I'm looking at artists from a woman's point of view, but also looking at them through their women's point of view. And in the case of the Stones, there were obviously many females who were used, abused, thrown aside, who had first-hand experience of these artists revered by the world for their music. And I never detract from that. But they had a different story to tell, and I wanted to bring them back to life, those who passed on.
We'll get to that. You spoke to over 70 people, I think, for fresh insights. Bill Wyman.
No, I didn't speak to him for this book this time. No.
Okay.
No, well, but the book kind of kicks off with him because we hadn't seen each other for about 30 years, and we had a confrontation. And that really took me down the path that I knew the book was going to go down.
Confrontation about what?
Well, it was in a church, St. Bride's, the journalist church on Fleet Street. Does anybody know that? I'm a church warden there. Rupert Murdoch had his marriage blessing when he married Jerry Hall. They weren't allowed to get married there because they both had living spouses, although as it turned out, Jagger wasn't actually a living spouse.
He wasn't
not really a
legally
spouse
married
at all.
to Jerry.
So he decided. But so they had their blessing. So they had a marriage ceremony at the church, and Bill Wyman and his wife Suzanne were guests that day, and he and I came face to face, and it was the first time I'd seen him for 30 odd years, and he'd used me as a shield to conceal his relationship with a 13-year-old child called Mandy Smith.
Okay, well, as you've mentioned that, tell us about that. You were dining with him, and he had other friends and that. And how do you think you were used as a shield? You know, he introduced Mandy to you. She was there. I don't know if you knew she was only, what, 14 or 13?
She was 13 at the time.
And her mother encouraged her to be friendly,
no,
did she not?
her mother wasn't there. I was there the night they met.
Oh, right.
At the Daily Mirror Rock and Pop Awards at the Lyceum in the Strand. And it was an award ceremony. Bill was there to accept an award on behalf of Alexis Corner, who'd not long died. And Andy Peebles was there from Radio 1, Mitch Ure was with us. And after the ceremony was over, there was dancing. Paul Sexton's favorite thing is dancing. And two girls, two very pretty blondes, got off and started whirling like dervishes, and Bill couldn't take his eyes off them. And that was how it all started. And after that, he constructed a mixed age friendship group. I was one of them. I was only young myself, so I didn't know what was going on. And we'd all go out as a group. And we didn't realize for years that this was deliberate, that he created this group of friends, all different ages, so it didn't look odd. The fact that he was in his 50s, and then there were teenagers and people in their early 20s and so on. We'd all go out, clubbing, restaurants, ending up at Tramp at the end of the night, and then the limousine would drop everybody home, and the last two left in the car were always Bill and Mandy. But of course we didn't twig that at the time. It was deliberate, yeah.
It's a very powerful chapter just on this, I must say, and you, obviously the safeguarding was not there, and you felt, I think, slightly guilty that you didn't intervene, is what you said, yeah, or not?
I mean, guilty to an extent that as a mother of three grown-up children now, but had anyone tried to use any of my kids when they were young and vulnerable, I would have done something about it. And I suppose I feel to some extent that I should have done something about it, but I was young myself, young, naive, unprotected, didn't realize what was going on. We were flattered by the fact that a Rolling Stone wanted to be friends with us. And we were living the high life. So we just didn't realize, but it's only, and I've discussed it with a few of the others. Russ Kane is another one. He was the Flying Eye, famously on Capital Radio for 25 years with Chris Tarrant. And he and I have discussed it a lot, and we both feel very disgruntled by what Bill did.
He went to see the police years later, didn't he? I mean, after they got married and maybe when they'd split, right?
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. So when Mandy was 18 and Bill was in his 50s, they got married, and people, there is a perception that because he married her, that the crime was negated, but it's not the case. And I interviewed a High Court judge who I wasn't able to name for the book, and said to him, why is Bill Wyman not in prison? Why Gary Glitter's in prison for being a paedophile? Why did Bill Wyman not go down for this? And he said, I don't know. All I can assume is that money changed hands. And this wouldn't be the first time in the history of the Rolling Stones that crimes were committed and that money changed hands, and people who should have gone to prison did not.
Something we'll come back to. Let's bring in Paul, because did you, in order to write the authorised biography of Charlie, sort of get his cooperation to do it when he was alive?
The history of the book, it goes back a couple of years, and somebody who approached me about the idea, actually, which was the subsequent publisher at HarperCollins, who saw a feature that I'd written on the Stones in the Sunday Times, and was keen on the idea of them doing something with Charlie, because I think, as I've often found, he's the least known member, he's the least reported, the one that we tend to know the least about. So we discussed it, we went back and forward on it a few times, and I said, well, let me make the approach, first of all. But the original idea was for it to be an autobiography, with me working on it with him. But I must say that I was never entirely comfortable with that idea, because he genuinely is the most modest man I've ever met in the music business. He's so low profile and selfless that I don't think it would have had the ring of truth about it. You know, if you're working on a book like that, clearly you would be interviewing the person a great deal. But first of all, his ego would not have suited a book like that. Second of all, Charlie had a very unusual, kind of hesitant style of talking. You know, and it took me a long time to figure this out when I started interviewing him, that he didn't really always express himself very well. So that, again, would have been another challenge in terms of writing his autobiography.
He's quite a shy guy.
Yeah, I mean, shy, I'm not sure I would quite use that word, because he was very confident and comfortable in his own skin, I would say. But he just very deliberately kept himself at the back, you know, literally and metaphorically, for nearly 60 years. And long story short, you know, as I said to the publishers at the very beginning, well, if we're going to do something on this subject, then don't hold your breath, because everything takes months in the world of the Stones, as I've known for a very long time. So it kind of rumbled on for a while. COVID came along, of course, got in the way, and eventually it became obvious to all of us that it was much more likely to work as a biography. Later on, he got poorly. And then, of course, as we know, he passed away. But by that time, I had approached his family. They were the only ones I didn't know. That's a kind of interesting thing, that for all of the years of interviewing the Stones and knowing the management and the whole setup, I didn't know his family at all, because they're every bit as private as Charlie is.
Well, you spoke to his wife, Shirley, and
I didn't speak to Shirley, actually.
You didn't?
No. She's not so well, and we decided not to go down that road. So
there's a lot about her.
Yeah, absolutely.
Arabian horses.
Yes, exactly.
Stuff like that on their farm, and they love dogs and all the rest of it. Spoke to his daughter, Serafina, and then her daughter.
That's right.
Charlie's granddaughter, Charlotte, which is interesting. His drum techie, his sister, I think.
Yeah, his sister Linda, who is 3 years younger than Charlie, and you know, she's so low profile, most people don't even realize that he had a sister. So she had never done an interview with anyone about him ever. So that was obviously, you know, a real compliment that she joined in. Really, in terms of it being an authorised book, the door was opened by Serafina, his daughter, I would say.
Engineer Chris Kimsey's in there. The backing singers, Bernard Fowler and Lisa Fisher, and Jules Holland. Some interesting comments. So what about Mick and Keith and Ronnie, and even Mick Taylor? Did you speak to them for this?
Yeah, it's all except for Mick Taylor. There's some excerpts from it, because there's a lot of archive material from, you know, the many interviews I've done with them over the years. So Mick Taylor was in that category.
Okay.
Mick, Keith and Ronnie all played ball, and you know, this is all while they were leading up to this tour that they've only recently finished, the 60th anniversary tour. And it felt different from any other interviews I've ever done with them, and there've been, you know, dozens really, because I suppose it makes a lot of sense, really. You know,
because he had passed away.
Yeah, and also it's not like a regular interview about the new album or the latest tour, or in their case, in recent years, the latest reissue, because there've been lots of those. It did feel like they really wanted to talk about their mate, you know, and give me more time. Mick was much more forthcoming than he often can be.
It's a really interesting story, and we'll pick out other bits along the way. But just quickly on you write a bit about each Stone and obviously how they got together. It was Brian Jones's band, really. He lived in Cheltenham, and he was taught, I think, the clarinet and the saxophone. He obviously played guitar, he obviously played harmonica too, and later the sitar. And he then came to London, didn't he? And he got gigs around London. And that was where I think he met Mick and Keith. Mick and Keith, famously born in the same nursing home, went to the same primary school, went their own ways for a bit, and perhaps allegedly met at a railway station or something, yes?
There's a bit of embroidery there. I think that they did go to the same infant school, which I went to, and then they went their separate ways for a bit, mainly because their families moved to different parts of that neighborhood, so that then they came back together eventually. But I'm not sure the railway station, they love to tell that story.
It's not true.
Who knows, there were no witnesses, you know.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it was Brian's band, and Brian brought that group of musicians together. He chose the songs that they would cover.
And he wanted it to be an R&B band.
He did. And there are letters which have come up for auction, which have sold for a lot of money, him writing to various people who worked for the fan club that he was bringing together at that time, in which he spelled out his manifesto, if you like, how he put the band together. So it was very much Brian's band.
Yeah.
And
they quickly, well, and you know, Alexis Corner was kind of big in this because he had his band called Blues Incorporated. People like Ginger Baker, Jack Bruce, and Long John Waldry played in there. There was a singer called Michael Philip Jagger, I think, as part of the Corner band, wasn't there? Now, Charlie, so R&B for obviously those three, but for Brian, Charlie, when he was at school, he collected jazz records and listened to jazz records.
Yeah.
How did that happen? Was that because jazz was around, or he didn't really like trad jazz, did he?
No, although he did play some in his early gigs, just to sort of get his feet wet kind of thing. But the great character in this early part of Charlie's story, completely unrecognised really, is Dave Green, who was his next door neighbour when they were growing up in Wembley in the prefabs. Dave is maybe 9 months younger than Charlie, but they just they hit it off immediately and found it was fairly improbable that they discovered they shared this love of jazz. So they would, they'd get hold of records and they'd play them in each other's bedrooms, and then a little later on they start going to gigs together in town.
He got a banjo first, and then got a drum kit, I think, when he was 14 for Christmas. This is Charlie, right?
Yeah,
he started playing along to Charlie Parker records at home.
He kind of lashed up his first drum kit from a banjo, and then his mum and dad kind of took pity on him and bought him a second-hand drum kit for Christmas.
And he had different ensembles, and he was guesting with around London, but he was also by then working as a graphic artist.
That's right.
So I think it was Brian Jones. Somebody said to Brian, "You need to get Charlie Watts in your band and drop Tony Chapman."
Tony Chapman, yeah, there was a few actually. It was kind of that role had not been satisfactorily filled, And you're right, Charlie was still working in graphic design and making quite a decent living, and very talented in that.
Yeah, and he had a couple of regular gigs, and he wasn't really keen on R&B. Wasn't really thinking he was going to make as much money as if he stayed working in graphic design.
Yeah, I mean,
and he was reluctant to join, and he didn't think the Stones would last.
The thing that comes true, and I've found this every time I met him, he didn't rate himself very highly, and this was not an affectation. He genuinely thought that he wasn't that great as a drummer. He always regretted that he didn't train, learn properly.
Wow.
Self-taught. It was almost impossible to pay him a compliment. He would just dismiss it, whatever it was, or to relay a compliment from somebody else, like Keith would every time would say how much he loved him, and if you relayed that to Charlie, he'd say, "Really? When did you last talk to him?" He'd sort of dismiss it. So,
yeah.
It's a combination of him not rating himself very highly, not thinking he was good enough for Blues Incorporated. That's why he really left there, and Ginger Baker came in, who he'd met some years before, actually, at the Troubadour. But meantime, he's obviously becoming, very skilled at at his craft, and comes to the attention of the Stones.
So he joins the Stones. Just want to quickly go through this. Ian Stewart was in the band as a keyboard player. He was kind of edged out, I think. And where did Bill Wyman come into this? I read, I'm sure, correct me if I'm wrong, that he originally played guitar, and he went to Aylesbury to see the Barron Knights. And he was so struck by the Barron Knights bass player, he said, "I want to play bass."
the only trouble was, he's still alive as far as I know. He has really tiny hands. And a bass is a really big instrument, and he was never really suited to the bass. But he had the amps that the Stones lacked. And when he brought those along to a rehearsal, he was shoot in because he had what they needed.
They played around, South London, Sutton, where you live.
Yeah, that's right.
Obviously, Richmond Athletic Club and the Ealing Jazz Club, blah, blah, blah. I've seen, some of the early footage of them in 62, 63. And they're all covers, as you say, at that time. Obviously, Muddy Waters, where they got the name from after a song, and Howling Wolf, Robert Johnson, and all of that. Chuck Berry, Come On, was their first hit. That was a cover of a Chuck Berry song. And then, obviously, Not Fade Away, a Buddy Holly song, and Little Red Rooster was a cover. But they were a really tight, rocking band, weren't they?
Yeah.
They put everything into the music. And once they got a couple of hit records, and Charlie joined, they did, I think in 6 months, 91 gigs.
That's right.
So they were working massively hard.
Yeah, Bill joined just before Charlie, but there's not only a matter of weeks really in between that. They had to talk Charlie into it. You know, when he finally joined and played his first gigs in the beginning of '63. But the story that Keith tells, and Keith does embellish things sometimes, but I think there's a grain of truth in this, that he and Mick went to see Charlie playing, or went to see a band playing R&B. And Keith says that it was a very crowded room and he could only just, he couldn't quite see what was happening on stage, but he heard these amazing drums. And the way Keith tells it in his usual entertaining way is that, all he could see was this left hand. And he said, I've got to find out what's connected to the hand, and that's who we need. And if we get him, we can conquer the world. Now that's I'm sure that's a very sort of there we go. There's a kernel of truth in it. I think that he was the last ingredient that they needed.
Okay, let's talk about Andrew Loog Oldham, because obviously the Beatles were doing similar things, covers of Motown stuff, and before they started writing. And Brian Epstein had them in suits, the mop tops. Andrew Loog Oldham presumably saw that, and he basically thought, we need to be slightly different. And he deliberately got them to be not dress as smart and kind of be a bit rough around the edges. And did he invent that term, or somebody said a term, you wouldn't want your sister to go with a Rolling Stone, yeah?
There's a few versions of
that. Yeah, there are.
But he did work, Andrew worked for the Beatles office. Before he met the Stones. And he was only 19, which is incredible to think now that such a young upstart could steal this band from under the nose of Georgia Gromulski, who was managing them to begin with.
Same age, wasn't he? Same age as the Stones.
Yeah, but couldn't sign any contracts because he was too young. So a similar scenario to the Beatles, who had to get their parents to sign contracts for Brian Epstein because they were too young. They were under 21.
Amazing.
But it wasn't really a question of designing them as dirty kind of tykes to go against the grain and to be the antithesis of the Beatles. It's just how they looked. That was how they were.
Sort of polo necks at that time and that 60s jumper top, that's not to me looking in very scruffy.
They were trying out different images at that time, but it wasn't really, none of that was them. It wasn't actually until they met Anita Pallenberg in Germany, who was a very stylish, very European, very 60s chick, who had quite an eccentric style of her own, lots of lace and ruffs and tapestry and velvets, and she styled them, she turned them from that bunch of tykes into the Rolling Stones, into rock stars. That was all her. It was a very similar thing to what Angie Bowie did with David Bowie, and didn't get any credit for it at all. When he did the David Bowie Is exhibition at the V&A, there was not one mention of Angie Bowie anywhere. She was completely wiped out. And the same thing with Anita as well.
Okay, we'll come back on to Anita. So I just read a bit. The image is deliberate, echoing Oldham's first impressions of Jagger as he stood watching him perform in the Station Hotel that first night. He dragged himself down there, utterly mesmerized. This is Loog Oldham. He would later describe Mick as an adolescent Tarzan, plucked from the jungle, not comfortable in his clothes. Perhaps he couldn't make up his mind whether to scarper or ejaculate. He had never seen anything like it. They came on to me. All my preparations, ambitions, and desires had just met their purpose. The music was authentic and sexually driven. It reached out and went inside me totally. It satisfied me. I was in love. This is Loog Oldham, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I heard what I always wanted to hear. I wanted it. It already belonged to me. Everything I'd done up until now was a preparation for this moment. I saw and heard what my life thus far had been for.
And the first thing they did was jump into bed together.
Mick and Andrew?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
That's extraordinary. That's not in the book, is it?
Yeah, well, in a roundabout way.
Yeah.
It's always in a roundabout way, isn't it, sex?
While you're there, I mean, somebody said that he was in love with Keith, Mick was, and they fell into bed maybe once, I don't know, David Bowie, Mick and Bowie, Mick and
Oh,
Keith
there was
Lambert.
there was a lot,
of that,
a lot of that with Jagger. And it's one theory of mine is that he chased so many women because he was afraid of the homosexual in himself. And he was trying to rid himself of that character.
And the partner of then Mick Taylor, a few years later, caught
Rose.
Mick and Mick Jagger and Mick Taylor in bed, and that's why he left the Stones, yeah?
This was during the recording of Exile on Main Street when Keith rented the Villa Nelcott in Villefranche-sur-Mer, and Mick was holed up in a hotel suite in Paris because Bianca, his new wife, who was pregnant, also didn't want to be in the south of France. Mick also had installed across Paris a young man who he'd met in California. So he had a gay lover across town, and he was traveling between Paris and Villefranche. And then Bill was along the coast in another rented house. Charlie was somewhere else. And they had the Stones mobile, you know, the recording truck, the famous recording truck that everybody used and has written about, on the driveway at the Villa Nelcott, and they were recording in the basement of this old mansion. And this was where Mick Jagger seduced Mick Taylor. And Mick Taylor was down there with his new, they weren't married at that point, they did get married later, but it didn't last, brand new baby. And Jagger got him out of his head on drugs and seduced him, and Rose walked in.
Stay with Exile on Main
He
Street.
went mad about this. I should just add, because it's quite important. Mick Taylor lost his marbles over this. He could not believe what he'd done.
Oh, I see.
And so he became addicted to Class A drugs and ultimately destroyed himself in much the same way as Brian Jones did.
So much to get through. You can see that sex and drugs go with the rock and roll big time here, if you didn't know already. Exile on Main Street then, it was a double album. It was the follow-up to Sticky Fingers. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my own perception is that, or it's been written about, that when the Beatles got into drugs and LSD, they made Revolver and then Sgt. Pepper. And that's supposedly helped the creative process, and it supposedly made the songs better. Now, a whole lot of stuff in the book, Lesley-Ann, about the debauchery and the drugs and the boozing and the hangers-on and other famous people dropping by, of the recording sessions for Exile, which probably took much longer than they would have done under normal circumstances. Did drugs fuel their creativity and improve their songs, do you think, or not?
Not at first, did it? I mean, you know, their attempt at being part of the Summer of Love, or at least the psychedelic year of '67, was, you know, not a success really. It was Satanic Majesty's album,
Which was a sort of a copy, trying to copy.
Yeah, they were off the pace really at that stage.
Yeah. But Exile is seen as being one of their best albums.
Yeah, possibly the best, I would think. So yeah, I mean, talking to them again many years later when it was reissued, which has turned out to be the first in a whole series of these deluxe editions that they've done of albums. I think Mick thought that, you know, he was perfectly open about what sort of an environment it was, and saying, you know, it's not a mill in the north of England, it's a rock and roll record, you know, rock and roll band. But his take on it in later years was that it was just got a bit boring because it just took so long to finish that record.
I'm not surprised, but all the partying got in the way.
Yeah.
Okay, well, look, let's talk a bit more about Anita, maybe Marianne Faithfull, Lesley-Ann. You've gone into quite a bit of detail about these relationships, and Anita was Brian's girlfriend, then later became Keith's girlfriend for quite a number of years, and then had an affair as well with Mick. But there's a lot of tragedy here. Mick's girlfriend later, of 9 years, Lorraine Scott, killed herself. Two of his other lovers, Chrissy Shrimpton, the sister of the model Jean Shrimpton, and Marianne Faithfull, attempted suicide. Brian's girlfriend, Suki, attempted suicide. It's horrific. So talk about Marianne Faithfull, Mick's muse, you say, Catholic convent girl, yeah? tell us a bit about her and why that's a sort of sad. Did you interview her for this book?
I didn't interview her for this book, but I had interviewed her in the past.
Yeah.
She was another tragedy waiting to happen, really. Somebody who was used and abused for her young beauty and her voluptuous figure, and told that they could make her a star. And
which she did by writing As Tears Go By.
Luke Alden met her at a party, and he dubbed her the angel with big tits. You know, you wouldn't get away with saying something like that nowadays. But those women were dragged along for the ride, and there was a lot of drugs involved. There was a lot of neglect involved. Marianne slept with every one of the Stones, so did Anita Pallenberg. And you can just imagine the scene: go round to somebody's flat, the one you're expecting to be there isn't there, but somebody else is there, and the drugs come out and the booze comes out, and you end up in bed with that person. That was very much the scene, but it was abusive towards those women. They didn't really realize what they were doing at the time.
And Anita, she, you say, was designing the way they looked and all the rest of it?
From really early on, from early mid-60s, yes. They met in Munich for the first time, backstage before a gig.
And at one stage, well, she was pregnant, and she was with Keith, and he took his 4-year-old son on tour. Is that right? I think at one stage, and then she was pregnant.
That's quite a bit further down the line.
Yeah, I'm trying to bring all the kind of women bit together. But let's talk about. She gave birth to Tara, who then died in a cot death at the age of 10 weeks.
They called it a cot death. Yeah. I think she was a heroin addict at the time, and she was
through the pregnancy
incapable of caring for a newborn. And Keith went off on tour and took Marlon, their son. He was just a little boy, about 3 years old. Marlon, who was hiding his father's gun when room service was coming to the bedroom, and was hiding his father's drugs, and who was incontinent at that time, this little boy, and who didn't get to go to nursery or even to school properly until he was about 10 years old. So there was lots of abuse and neglect of those children at the time. But Keith heard in a phone call that his baby was dead. He then went out on stage and played a gig. Instead of doing what any normal person would have done and jump in the car and drive through the night to get there, to be supportive of their partner to whom this has just happened, he went out on stage and played a gig. So complete denial. Keith Richards doesn't even know where that little baby's buried. And his answer to that question was, if he was buried, which I find utterly appalling.
And if he was the father, it could have been Mick.
Could have been mixed, yeah.
You say that Mick Jagger he's had an estimated 4,000 lovers.
These were the ones I could prove.
Yeah, I'm going to say.
The list was a lot longer, but...
You published a list. Brigitte Bardot, Jane Fonda, Tina Turner, Linda Eastman, before she married Paul McCartney, I guess, Daryl Hannah, Sophie Dahl, lives up the road. Madonna, Minnie Driver, Uma Thurman, Carla Bruni, who married a French president, and Carly Simon.
Not funny though, is it really? It's not funny because Mick was in long-term relationships and had children at the time that all these affairs took place. So, well, they weren't really affairs, they were mostly one-night stands, but women don't like being used like that.
So he was lustful and he liked the chase? Or
it was all about the chase for him. We know from Keith's own autobiography that Mick was under-endowed. Keith chose to share that with us and had a very low sex drive. And this all kind of ties...
Low?
Yes.
Sounds the opposite.
The performance wasn't as good as the promise. But that's quite common among men, isn't it, ladies? I mean, so, but I don't think we could admire Mick Jagger at all for his...
You don't?
No, I don't. I really... How could you admire somebody who behaves like this?
But he's now a knight of the realm.
Yeah. Interesting, isn't it?
And they were seen at the time as anti-establishment.
Yeah.
And got busted for drugs and put in prison, and the Times defended them and got them released.
Yes, yes, all of that is true. But it's degrees, isn't it? It's and perception, and also the morals of the time. And they were seen as the scourge of society in the 60s, the Stones. But now they're revered as, not just as rock gods, but as pillars of the establishment, knighted to boot.
Do you think then that they did corrupt the nation's youth?
No, I think the nation's youth corrupted itself, really. That was always on the cards. It was always coming. I don't think a bunch of musicians can possibly be given that accolade of having corrupted a whole generation, but they were partly the soundtrack to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He got married to Bianca, and I want to read a passage from the book. You're quoting a psychotherapist. Mick married Bianca because he needed his Wendy, says this psychotherapist, Richard Hughes, and he gave himself a wife he thought reflected the man he now was. Because who is Mick other than Peter Pan, with Keith, Charlie and Bill as his tribe, his lost boys? He's on this endless quest for a Wendy. In other words, his mum. All those bimbos with the Tinkerbells. He'd had all the groupies, and he'd had the most beautiful women in the world, but had found fulfillment with none of them. He sensed that he had to couple in order to survive, not that he would have had any intention of staying faithful. So he winds up marrying himself, Bianca. He then proceeds to disown all the aspects of her that he cannot tolerate or accept about himself. That's a pretty telling, damning kind of analysis.
But it also demonstrates how the minute Mick Jagger gets what he wants, he completely loses interest and he has to go and get something else. So the best relationship he ever had was with Jerry Hall. So he has 4 children with Jerry Hall. He also impregnates another woman while Jerry herself is pregnant. This was Luciana Morad, mother of his son Lucas. Yeah. And it was at that point when Jerry discovered that not only was she pregnant with his child, but also someone else was. This is shameful behavior. And she went, enough's enough. I'm sorry, but I'm not taking this anymore. And she kicked him out. I think she was probably about the only person to do so. But what was really disgusting, what happened after that, everyone knows this, that he went to the High Court and he had their marriage declared invalid because they married in Bali in a sort of Hindu ceremony, which is quite meaningless really if you're not Hindus, which they aren't. But it was a civil arrangement really, but the paperwork was never signed off. And Mick went to extreme lengths to turn his own 4 children with Jerry into bastards by declaring that this marriage wasn't valid. Who does that?
Have you had any comeback from the Stones about this since the book came out?
No.
No.
Because it's all true.
But you've met Mick and presumably talked mostly about the music, none of this stuff.
Yeah.
I think that he would be ashamed of it or say, yeah, you know, I got it wrong, I was a bit of a monster.
I have to say it's not the sort of interview I would do, really. I mean, being a what I've always done really is write music features, newspapers and magazines and so on, and music will always be the focus. Now, you know, it's for other people to go down that path with him, but I think it feels to me as though in more recent years there's perhaps a little bit more self-realization about him.
Ben, did you got a question from comments?
A couple of virtual questions coming in. I guess we'll go to audience questions as well, so do get your hands up. There'll be a roving mic going around as well. But I've got one question, a chap called Dave. It's aimed at you, Lesley-Ann. Is there a danger that you're judging, the quote, is it dangerous you're judging the Stones by today compared to the era? You know, over 60 years, it's changed quite a lot. That's his question.
First of all, I'm not judging at all. My job isn't to judge. I give opinions, but I don't judge. This story tells itself. The behavior judges itself. So I'm not the judge here. I am just conveying and putting into context in one place, which was, I suppose, if I had an overall aim at any stage, it was to bring this story between 2 covers, the whole of it, the good, the bad, the ugly, and allow it to judge itself. So no, I'm not the judge here.
Okay. One other?
No, let's go to the audience question. I know there's one or two. There's one just here on the other side, Dave. Just come around here.
Okay.
Hello. Actually, my question's about Bill Wyman, and it comes as a result of those recent televised biographical documentaries of the Stones, which I thought was really, really good. Everyone had a good mention. Brian Jones was mentioned, Mick Taylor was mentioned. Bill Wyman was airbrushed out of it completely. Now, I hear what you're saying about the implications of Mandy, but they've all got scars and baggage from the band. So why do you think he was actually airbrushed out of those documentaries?
It's interesting you use the word airbrush, because we were talking backstage
About that very series.
and that very word came up, airbrushed, and it is the case. So what Bill did, which was commit paedophilia, was heinous, even by their standards, and it tainted the band's reputation. He left the band in 1991, but they didn't announce it to the world until 1993, because they didn't know how to bounce back from this, really. They were all poisoned by that, and Bill had to go, but they made it look as though he chose to leave and that Mick tried to persuade him to stay. It's not actually true. They wanted rid of him, and they wanted him as far away as possible. And there have been a couple of occasions where they've brought him back for the 50th anniversary and so on. When they opened their exhibition down in Chelsea, he was there. But it has been frosty, and it's not been true involvement. It's a bit like, it's what I nowadays call Prince Andrew syndrome. You know, there's no way back from that. How, even if they decide that Prince Andrew didn't do whatever he did after all, and that the woman remembered it incorrectly, I don't think that's true. There's an awful lot of smoke, and the fire isn't far behind. It's that kind of effect with Bill. I don't think Bill can ever come back from that.
But it wasn't even discussed. I mean, that in its own, there's a whole discussion and documentary on that on its own, really, isn't there?
There is. I think it would need to involve Mandy, who was his victim. And Mandy doesn't want to speak about it. She did a book called It's All Over Now, which Andy Coulson wrote for her. Andy Coulson, as we know, was one of the major figures in the phone hacking scandal and ended up in prison and was used and abused. You know, that this story comes around and around. But yeah, Bill, what is he, 84?
86.
86
yeah.
now, okay. So it kind of...
He paid her off, didn't he?
She got very little money, and yeah, there was a lot of bad stuff said about Mandy at the time, and also that her mother had facilitated the relationship. Not true, her mother was sick at the time. The worst aspect of that relationship, which was very telling, Mandy lived on a council estate in North London with her mum and her sister. The dad had fled years ago, and Bill lived in a flat above 344 Kings Road. A French restaurant was there at the time called Thierry's, which he used to eat in most days. And he decided that Mandy needed to be nearby to go to school. Imagine this. We're talking about this as though it's a normal thing. This is a child. He decides that she has to come out of her school in North London. He enrolls her at a private girls' school in Chelsea, which is a short walk from his flat. And she goes to school in her uniform every day and comes home from school in her uniform, and then gets dolled up, and then they go off up to the West End to have dinner and go to tramp. Not normal at all, but it gets worse. The headmistress of that school knew how old she was. The bursar of that school, who was accepting Bill Wyman's money to pay her school fees, knew how old she was. How come none of them told anybody?
Thank you for your question. I just want to move it along a bit because obviously time is a bit short, but then, you know, they didn't split. It's amazing that they're all still alive and got to this amazing age and still performing. It got a bit corporate in the late 80s and the 90s. Some of their tours were grossing $300 million. One tour, I think, grossed $585 million. but they had 100 people to put up the stages. These were big, grand touring shows. Mick was taking control of that, and some of it was being designed by Charlie, and it was all massive in that.
Yeah.
Did their performance suffer? I mean, there's a couple of schools of thought. Some say that their best work was when Mick Taylor was in the band, maybe 71 to 76. I think the zenith, according to Charlie, was 69 to 74. Talk a bit about, the later stages of the band. They're just a brand, just in it for the money, just in it for the marketing, and the music went downhill.
I would dispute that, but I mean, from the recording point of view, I think that the commonly held belief is that the heyday is the run of albums from 68 to 72. I think you'd probably say with Exile as the last one of those. And you're right, Charlie was extremely proud of those records. I mean, he was very proud of the Stones as a band. Much as he played himself down completely. He loved being in the Rolling Stones, and he was extremely proud of what they achieved. Yeah, sure. By the time you get to you take the Steel Wheels tour as really the beginning point of the stadium, Enormodome years.
And you blame Live Aid for that. Instead of the music changing the world, it's the other way around, that the world changed music and made it big and corporate and stadium-like.
Live Aid did change music because it made the investors around the world, the whole corporate setup. Same thing happened in football. And I make the comparison in the book that suddenly they realized, the pennies dropped, how much money there was to be made out of rock and roll. So that was a defining moment, not in terms of feeding the world, but in terms of rock and roll becoming corporate. At that point, the Rolling Stones, who were the biggest band in the world, became the biggest brand in the world.
On the touring, some fascinating stuff. Charlie was a man of style, even from the age of 2, when he got a lovely coat. He was very sort of clothes conscious.
And a beret. Picture him with his parents in Trafalgar Square with a lovely coat and a beret on age 2.
Bought his suits at Savile Row. And even back in the day, a pair of handmade shoes cost £4,000. A lot more now, probably. You've got loads.
Yeah.
Tell us about going on tour. He packed meticulously. He was a bit OCD like that.
It was OCD like everything, actually, in all respects. And I think that's why one of the main reasons that he and Bill bonded very quickly when they joined the band, because they share a lot of those tendencies. Yes, I mean, a man of style from the very beginning. I mean, at one point he described himself as a little Lord Fauntleroy when he was a kid, but it came from his dad. I mean, we know that much as they really were pretty working class, his father was a very stylish man, and had suits made.
Right.
By Taylor.
He was a lorry driver to start with, wasn't he?
For the railways, yeah.
And then he went in the RAF, obviously in the war.
Yeah. So a lot of it comes from Charles Senior. And as soon as Charlie had money, not that they had much, and this is absolutely right, the serious money doesn't arrive till the 90s, really. But in the 60s, as soon as he's able to, he has no problem at all in spending quite a lot of money on himself, but also a great deal on other people as well. He would, from the very first tours of the States and everywhere else, he'd be in antique shops or clothes shops or whatever, indulging his various, and his other collections as well, like silverware, and he had a thing about American Civil War memorabilia. He had all these extraordinary collections of first-day covers, first editions of books.
And he lived near a bookshop when that bookshop was able to get good stuff that he wanted, and he was very generous in giving books to people. And Jules Holland you interviewed, there's a lot of stuff from him which is really fascinating, as well as giving goods or presents to people that worked for him.
Yeah, he would take a lot of time and trouble to really find gifts that meant something to people.
Examples?
Well, Jules would say, and I've known Jules for quite a long time, and I didn't realize quite exactly how close he became to Charlie, and toured with him, and in the jazz lineups later on and so on. He would go out of his way to find things that he knew they were both, from their conversations that he was interested in. It might be just a little, playbill from an old blues artist show or something like that.
Yeah.
Not always the most, valuable thing, but just something that would mean a great deal to the individual. He did that with all of the people in and around the Stones organization, including Bill. There was an interesting thing about Charlie, which was that, keeping it to the music part of this, that when Bill left, Charlie actually felt rather bad about the fact that he left around the time that they actually started to make the serious money. But you've got to remember that in both of their cases, neither of them wrote. So, you know, it was a qualified thing.
How good a drummer was he? You know, if you compare him to, say, John Bonham of Led Zeppelin, Keith Moon of The Who, and maybe Ringo Starr, and then Ringo's son, Zach Starkey, who plays with The Who, and I've seen him, I think he's amazing.
Yeah, yes.
Phil Collins and Phil Collins' son on the last tour, their last ever tour, Nick Collins.
Yep.
Different kind of a drummer.
Yeah, different kind of a drummer. I mean, I don't think anyone would call him the best drummer in the world.
Not a technician, you say?
No.
What is it then? That's good about
Well, a lot of it was coming from jazz, I think, you know, and people would say, I mean, I'm not a musician, but people would say that he would play across the beat, you know, which I think was partly his jazz leanings that did that. I think his style has a lot to do with the general feel that you get on a Rolling Stones record, which is that looseness. You know, if you compare them to, say, The Who or Zeppelin or any of the other contemporaries.
it's kind of a vibe, a groove.
It is, yeah. And
it's all feel.
Yeah, and everyone around them, but the band themselves always used to say that it's just one stage away from all falling apart. You know, it has that kind of feel about it. But
What
I
was
think
he like in his 60s, in late 60s and 70s? Because his last gig was 2019, when he was 77.
That's right.
I mean, he must physically demand it.
Yeah.
As you say in the book, Mick Jagger, if he doesn't want to run down the stage or move left or right, he doesn't have to.
No.
He decides. But Charlie, he's got to peak.
Exactly. Yeah. No. Mick said that in this recent interview for the book, that he thought that Charlie was the hardest working member of the band, because it's Mick's choice whether he goes whizzing across the stage like that. But Charlie's there at the back for 2.5 hours probably. You know, literally the timekeeper for the whole thing. And I don't actually know how he did it, because he's quite a slight man. He's about the same build as me, actually. You know, and very wiry. A lot of the time, especially in later years, he didn't look after himself very well. Actually, after he got straight, you know, I mean, I think for 6 months after that, he said he lived on water, nuts, and sultanas. So he wouldn't really.
Mick famously worked out, probably still has to.
Yeah.
But if he wasn't touring for years, he might have been playing at home, or he might have played in the odd gig with somebody else. But I mean, do you have to build up your strength as a drummer to prepare to be match fit for touring?
I think you do, but there were never long gaps. I mean, I think that's the point. You know, in later years, he developed the time to make jazz records and to tour those. Yeah. You know, his name didn't appear on a record at all in his own right until the mid-'80s. And
you've listed them and talk about them as some amazing jazz records he's part of.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, a conversation with Charlie about jazz was a completely different thing from a conversation about rock and roll. He never listened to the Rolling Stones records. People find it hard to believe this, but he was not a fan of them in that way. He loved them in the studio at the point of creation of the track. Yeah, that was what he loved. He would never really listen to the finished take. I mean, sometimes I tell him that there was some reissue had come out, and he'd be like, "Is it?" He doesn't even know about it, you know, and very distanced from it in that way.
And in later concerts, though, just occasionally, he had somebody in the wings who might have to remind him what he had to do in case he'd forgotten or had forgotten. Yeah,
there's a couple of funny. Mick was quite funny about that, but he said I think on probably the last tour that Charlie did, which was, as you say, was 2019. Sometimes in rehearsals, partly because he didn't play the records, he would occasionally, there'd be in rehearsals, and Mick would say, "You're playing it wrong, playing it all wrong," and he would get his phone out and play him the track on Spotify to remind Charlie of what he, and you know, then he put him straight, sort of thing. You know.
What song is his best example of his work? Everybody says the cowbell and the drumming at.
Jumping Jack Flash, yeah.
Well, and no, Honky Tonk Woman. Yeah?
Honky Tonk Woman. I mean, I think there's so many. From that classic first period, you know, 19th Nervous Breakdown is amazing when you listen to what he was doing in quite a limited, you know, we're talking about 4-track tops, really.
First album I bought was the greatest hits collection called Through the Glass Darkly.
Through the Glass Darkly, yeah.
Where the corners of the sleeve were cut at an angle. And so their version, Ruby Tuesday, the chorus comes in, "Goodbye, Ruby Tuesday."
Yes.
Like a machine gun.
It's amazing, yeah. Actually, that's an unusually showy performance for Charlie. I mean, normally it's quite restrained.
I'm getting looks that we've got quite a few questions or comments.
Well, I think it was quite apt, and it kind of pulls both authors together, really, in terms of, it's a question from Bill. Given Charlie,
Well, Ronnie's got a house up the road.
not Bill Wyman, no. Given Charlie Watt's different moral stance and personal behaviours, how did he manage to put up with the morals and behaviours of the others, especially as they weren't even playing the sort of music they like? I suspect the answer is money, but I'm sure there may be more to that.
There's a large part of it, yeah, but I mean, I wouldn't want to paint him as purely as a mercenary, Charlie. He had this extraordinary loyalty to the idea of the Rolling Stones, and they were friends. I mean, they, much as he would keep himself to himself quite a lot on tour, and he was perfectly happy in his own company. Sometimes he'd go out late at night and just walk around, or he'd phone around the other rooms and see if anybody was still awake. But he had a sense of loyalty towards the thing called the Rolling Stones, which was the thing that always drew him back. He famously said that he resigned at the end of every tour since 1969, and then he would always say, "They've talked me into it again," And yes, obviously the money was a huge part of that, but it's not the only thing by any means. I think, and in the later years, because the touring schedules changed in the last, say, 10 or 15 years, he did have more time to pursue his true passion, which was jazz.
Yeah.
And as I was in the middle of saying before, the conversation with him about jazz was completely different. He was like a collector. He knew every lineup of every record, not just the principals, but everybody on playing. And obviously the drummers on those jazz records were his complete heroes, whether it's well-known people or Chico Hamilton or those kind of guys.
A bit like Bill, because Bill is an archivist of blues music, isn't he?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
And he set up famously the Bill Wyman Rhythm Kings. So the knowledge they have is unbelievable.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting to talk to them about playing on other people's records. There was a period in the early 70s where Bill and Charlie were both quite in demand and played with people like Leon Russell and Howlin' Wolf, actually, when he came over here. Yeah. And there, Charlie's lack of confidence kind of came to the fore. He would be like, "I don't think I can do this." It's amazing to think when the disparity between how revered he was and how lacking in self-belief he was.
He loved his home life, and he loved getting back home at the end of a tour. And in some of the times, he would phone home every day and spend a fortune on calls from Australia.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in the early tours, I think it was that first tour of Australia. And you remember that international phone calls used to cost a fortune, right? You remember that? And, they were not making big money, and he would just spend it all on phoning home every day because, he's left Shirley at home.
Then she would come on tour, and then there's a lot of stuff which is really interesting about how Serafina came on tour, his daughter. And then Charlotte,
yes, I mean,
it's
incredible.
She sort of worked or was on the payroll for him. Yeah?
That's one of the things.
And then he felt that he had home with him on tour.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that just brings it home to you, just exactly how long they've been doing this. It's a generational thing. Serafina went on to some of the early shows when she was reasonably young, but as she said to herself, it was a terrible environment. It was not a place for children to be at that time. It was very toxic.
Quickly, because we've not mentioned him on drugs, he did have a situation, a midlife crisis, male menopause. And is it true that he punched Mick in front of loads of celebrities somewhere? It was near a balcony, so he could have fallen out the window, Mick. And then he got into drink and drugs.
Yeah.
Charlie Watts.
It's the famous story. In fact, it's almost become, when I've been talking to people about Charlie and doing the book, it's the first thing that a lot of people say is, "Oh, he said that great thing about, I'm not your effing drummer, you're my effing singer." So when I spoke to Mick again for this, I said, "There's something I do have to ask you, isn't there?" And I thought he would sidestep it because he can do that, but he kind of addressed it head on. The problem with it is it's a bit like Chinese whispers. I mean, it's a long time ago, it was in the mid-80s, as you say, and Keith wrote what he thinks is the definitive version of that story in his book Life. Bill has a different version of it again. And then Mick it was like version 3 from him, with different elements of it being true in each case. They're even disputing which city it took place in, The one thing Mick did admit was that, I think he sort of tacitly admitted it by saying, "It's not the worst thing you can say about someone, is it?" Which is sort of like a typical Jagger kind of comment. But he disputes the fact that it ever came to blows. Okay. He says, but it's interesting, and clearly that means that Charlie wanted to hit him, even if he didn't.
You got a quote here from Charlie about this period, but I never used to indulge in anything in excess until about the age of 45, so the male menopause, you might say, and I tried everything then, and I very nearly killed myself. I don't mean overdosing or anything like that. I mean, I nearly killed myself spiritually. I nearly ruined my life. I did everything totally out of character, because that's what drugs do to you. They make you wonky in more ways than one, and drinking a lot. Now, luckily, thanks to my wife, I've stopped everything. I've never broken anything in my life, and I broke my ankle going down to the cellar to get yet another bottle of wine at my home. I was playing at Ronnie's, that's Ronnie Scott's, I think, in about 3 months' time. I'd booked the orchestra in there, and I thought, this is it. It's ridiculous. What have you done? And I stopped virtually from there. I eased off everything.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't quite cold turkey, but it was pretty close to that. And Serafina, his daughter, said to me that's one of the things she's most proud of, is that he just, came to his senses, really, and just sorted himself out. No rehab, no fuss, I don't think there's any press about it. That's all either. So he had a strange relationship with it. He said, because it's right around that same time that he was putting together that big band to do a week of shows at Ronnie Scott's, his beloved Ronnie's, when they were in financial trouble. And he did later say that, because it's a fantastic band, Jack Bruce and Stan Tracy and a young Courtney Pine, all kinds of people playing in that thing. And he said that if he hadn't been on the stuff, he wouldn't have had the courage to actually ask to put that thing together. But because it was so successful, and the Stones didn't tour around that time, he had the time to take it one step further, which was to go on the road with it in the States. By that time, he was getting clean. So it's a real double-edged thing. He recognized that, potentially ruinous as it was, there was at least that one thing that he did, again, a sign of how lacking in confidence he was.
I like the fact that he's different, that he's an individual, and he didn't make no bones. He wasn't anything he wasn't. What you saw was what he got, I think.
Yeah.
I saw him in a radio studio once when I read the sports news in Nicky Campbell's Mid-Morning Show on 5 Live. And this is Charlie Watts, and he's just a lovely guy.
Yeah.
More questions? Any from the audience? Others from you here?
The audience will be very quiet, so let's...
They've all gone. Have they gone to sleep?
You're clearly not doing very well.
You've got some more?
Is there... there was a point that...
There's a chap here with
Let's go to you first, actually.
Why do you think Brian and later his estate got nothing from the Stones, not even his clothes?
Well, there's all kinds of theories about that, aren't there? It wasn't fair, wasn't right, but I think we know about Mick Jagger and his parsimonious leanings. The way that business was run. Mick Taylor didn't get his fair dues either. Didn't even get credits on the records at the right time. Has been living until quite recently in penury in Suffolk in a shack, playing the odd pub gig. He's got a new girlfriend now, so he's living in the Netherlands, and he's been driving around in a 25-year-old car. It isn't fair. Talk to the lawyers. How do you resolve that one? Why? They've got more money. The way Mick Taylor put it was that they know I'm not rich enough to sue them. And I suppose Brian Jones's family, the same thing. They wouldn't have had enough money to take them to task for it. It would have cost them more than they would have got. So I suppose they left it.
You mentioned Andrew Loog Oldham had been working in the PR department for the Beatles, and Alan Klein worked for the Stones, and of course he worked for the Beatles as well, and then that all fell apart.
Except Paul McCartney, yeah.
Yeah. Was Klein ripping off the Stones?
Klein ripped everybody off. Klein ripped himself off, I think, in the end.
Is that why they set up their own Rolling Stones label?
Yeah, basically.
Of course, yeah, because the Beatles had done it first and it worked for them.
I mean, it was to get out of the ruinous Decca contracts, which was ruinous before Klein came along, but he effectively made things worse.
Yeah. We haven't talked about Brian Jones's death, and some really interesting stuff in there, because, again, was that all glossed over by the Stones? Was he drowned because he was under the influence of drink or drugs? You get a confession out of a builder who claimed that he'd had a dispute and he pushed him in the water.
There are so many conspiracy theories, just as it's Princess Diana syndrome, isn't it, really? It's when somebody dies and it's somebody of great importance and there is no definitive answer to why they died. Conspiracy theory, it's a Loch Ness Monster. Conspiracy theories about Brian will always persist because we can't know. We can't know the answer. My personal view is just from everything I've read and people I talk to and piecing it together. He was asthmatic. Their inhalers were found around the swimming pool that night. I think that he was probably under the influence and he just went under and stopped breathing. I don't think anybody tried to drown him.
But he'd been bullied by Mick and Keith.
Yeah, he had, and they came to see him because there were two things going on, that he wanted to leave the Stones. They wanted him to leave as well because they couldn't go to America because he had a drugs conviction and they wanted to go on tour. So they had to get rid of him. But also, there was a suggestion that he was going to keep the name, the Rolling Stones, and start a new band with other musicians, some sort of supergroup. Jimi Hendrix and various other names were in the frame. And they couldn't allow him to do that. So there was a motive, if you wanted to pin it on them and say, well, they killed him. But there's another theory that Mick and Keith started to kill Brian years before, when they started to write songs together. And it emerged that Brian could not write songs, even though he was a gifted musician. He couldn't write songs, he couldn't write lyrics or melodies. And also he couldn't sing. So these two things were against him. And where Keith and Mick had forged this relationship from when they were really little boys, it's a Beach Boys thing, it's an Everly Brothers thing. That harmony is almost a sibling gift. And there was that musicianship, deep musicianship in them that Brian couldn't get a look in. So he was then an outsider from the minute they started to create their own songs.
And that was all done down to Andrew Loog Oldham, who sort of locked them in a room. You've got to write your own songs, like
so
Lennon
the theory
and
goes, yeah.
Yeah?
But yeah, I think...
But they delivered the goods instantly.
Yeah, but I think technically Mick and Keith had been killing Brian for years.
Yeah, I get that. I see what you're saying. Go on then, Ben.
We're sort of running over, but the questions are coming through again. And this is quite a nice one if we are going to start closing. E.L., such inside information from two very interesting authors. Thank you so much for doing this. Have we seen the last of the Stones now, or will they stay on the circuit for a bit longer?
Yeah, they will. They're they are making, this is sort of off the record, but they're finally working on the new album. They haven't made a new studio record of new material since 2005, so they're breaking their own records here. This will be 18 years later, but they are doing it now. So
they're in a recording studio as we speak.
Yeah.
In New York. The thing, nobody really wants new music.
No, I mean,
Rolling Stones.
Yep.
People go along to see the Rolling Stones. They want nostalgia. They want Jumping Jack Flash. They want honky tonk women. They want satisfaction. They don't want the new songs.
But I mentioned it because
They've never
it means
wanted the new songs.
they will they'll tour next year. Yeah.
You both saw them live on the 60th anniversary tour. What were they like? You're a bit indifferent.
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
I'm not indifferent, as you know.
Still as exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky to see the first show in Madrid, which just fit the deadline for the book. So it's kind of the last scene, really, in there. And it's very odd. I mean, it's just from a visual point of view to see somebody else in the back there, But Steve Jordan, who is the guy, and he did have Charlie's blessing, that is true.
On drums. Yeah.
On drums. Is a fantastic drummer. He's not he's a much more muscular drummer than Charlie.
But it's not the Stones, is it? I mean, the minute you bring in, it's like Paul McCartney with his band out there doing Glastonbury. It's not the Beatles. Nobody's saying it's the Beatles, but it's not the Stones. You've only now got two originals.
But I've seen the Who without Entwistle and Moon.
Of course, and it's not the Who.
But they're a sensational band.
They're fantastic.
It's they're their own covers band, is what they are. But Keith Richards has said that he will die on stage. What he actually said was, I'm going to die live on stage. Okay, I want to see that. Not in a macabre way, but that's the ultimate rock and roll experience, isn't it? To see Keith Richards die on stage.
Is he clean now? Has he been clean for a while?
So he says.
Yeah, he's pretty, yeah. I think he's actually given up smoking.
Wow.
God.
He did smoke his dad. He has admitted to that. But it was...
Yes, his ashes.
It
mixed
was a
with something.
story that became embellished and was doing the rounds for such a long time. The story as he tells it, his dad Bert did die. He was cremated. He did have the ashes in a container, and he decided to plant a tree on his estate upstate New York, and to plant the ashes in under the tree and become part of this oak tree. Quite a personal thing to do. Lovely thing, really, if you think about it. And he had the urn on the table. It was a windy day. The urn tipped over and the lid came off, and some of the ashes spilled out onto the table. So he said, well, what are you going to do? I could scoop them up. And he said, I just sort of brushed them into my hand, and I had a spliff on the go. So I just kind of rolled them in and smoked them. So he did not smoke the whole urn full of his dad, but he did smoke the bit that spilled out. So yeah, it's quite a neat story, I think.
Mick will be 80 in July. So that's going to be interesting. Keith is 78, but will be 79 next month, and Ronnie is 75.
Amir.
Quick, what's your favourite Rolling Stones album and song? Can be for different albums.
It probably is Exile.
Yeah.
Song. No, song would probably be Gimme Shelter, I think.
Okay. Lesley-Ann?
Unfortunately...
You're younger than me, so I remember them growing up.
I hope so, yeah. I also favour Exile on Main Street, but my favourite song, it veers between one track off that album, Tumbling Dice, which I actually wrote a memoir, and it's published in 2019. It's called Tumbling Dice, because I saw it as a metaphor for my life, but of course it's a metaphor for everybody's life, really. But I also love Waiting on a Friend, because it's a song that it was who I thought the Stones really were. You know, I found out much later on that they weren't really those guys, but it's who I wanted them to be. And there's a great video that accompanies that song, and there's Mick sitting on a stoop, and then Keith comes wandering along the road, and they have a hug and they kiss, and it's like old chums, and then they wander down this bar, go downstairs, and the others are waiting in the bar, and they're just hanging out, and it seemed like they really care about each other. And then they kind of move to the back of the bar, and they pick up their instruments, and they start to play. And they convinced me that's who I wanted the Rolling Stones to be. But I know too much now.
That was from the Tattoo You album of '81, and that was part of our little sequence of songs that you may have heard as you came in. And I picked
Great sax solo by Sonny Rollins on that track as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Charlie enjoyed that. You know, he said, "You'll never get him."
He did, didn't he? Yeah. And they did. Well, look, ladies and gentlemen, here in the Baptist Church of the High Street of Tring on day 7 of the Book Festival, thank you so much for coming along. And for you at home, I hope that was enjoyable. Fascinating. We could talk for another hour and a half quite easily.
He's going to make us talk all night.
Make it a double album or whatever, but we're not allowed to.
Double album.
Ladies and gentlemen, please would you give your appreciation to Paul Sexton and Lesley-Ann Jones.
Thank you. Thank you.
Could I say thank you to Mike Naylor? Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, Mike.